Phil Crozier from Bedford, England. Yes, are you in Bedford?
Originally, yes.
Originally?
No, I'm not in Bedford. I grew up in Bedfordshire, but no, I was born in London actually, and I now live in an area called the Peak District in the north of England, near to Manchester.
Right. So, Phil told me he knows all the bad words in Polish because he grew up with the Polish kids. Yes, in Bedford. Right. Phil is an ambassador of Argentinian wines to Europe, including Britain. And yes, Phil, this is your show, so I'm just here to support you and to change the slides.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to introduce myself a little bit first. I unwittingly created the first all Argentine wine list in the world outside of South America in 1999 when I was working for a restaurant group called Gaucho. They're pretty well known in the UK. They have 18 restaurants. They also have one in Hong Kong, one in Dubai, one in Beirut that I opened. And at that time, I think we had 4 restaurants. We just opened one in the city of London. It occurred to me that we should do an all Argentine wine list because we were an Argentine restaurant, which kind of sounds very logical today, but it was not a logical thing to do at all because there were only 13 wineries available in the market in 1999. And so I got to find out who was importing them, and I had samples, and then I started tasting samples. I didn't know very much about wine at that time, so my naivety really, which I think is a good thing in many ways, led me to make that decision. And then over the next 20 years, I went to Argentina. We bought vineyards there. I managed a vineyard for about 10 years, a very old vineyard in Mendoza. And we started making our own wines. I started making wines there with a few winemakers, not actually making the wine, but blending. I did a lot of blends and commissioned wines from a number of wineries all over Argentina until I left in 2018. We had about 250 wines from Argentina covering sparkling, rosé, white and red. And we became pretty well known as the place to go for Argentine wine. My education has been a great education. I've been educated by winemakers. I didn't have a formal education in wine, and I kind of stuck my head in books and became very passionate, and still I'm very passionate about Argentina and its wines. I went there for the first time in 1999. And this was when the industry was completely different to what it is today, and we'll go through some of that when we start going through the wines. But I don't think there has been a country that has changed so much in such a short period that there is in Argentina. It's quite astonishing, all the changes that have taken place and how they are still taking place. So firstly, I'd like to thank Peter for helping me with the samples and getting everything organized for this, and also thank the wineries for taking part, the 12 wineries that are taking part today. So let's get started. Next slide, please, Peter. Okay, just a little overview of Argentina. It's the 8th largest country in the world. It's the 2nd largest country in South America. It's the largest winemaking country in terms of volume in the Southern Hemisphere. The national drink of Argentina is wine. It's known as Bebida Nacional, and it is considered to be essential to life, which was very fortunate because when the pandemic took hold in March last year, the whole country shut down, but winemaking was still was still going on as it's considered essential to life. I think there's one other country in the world that thinks the same, and that's Italy. And a population of 45.4 million. Buenos Aires, which is the second capital for wine in the world after Paris in terms of the amount of wine consumed. So it's very much entrenched in the culture of Argentina and all of the different cultures that came to Argentina over the last hundreds of years since Columbus. It's a real melting pot of mostly European influence. Next slide, please, Peter. So just a little overview very quickly, the natural factors that combine. The terroirs are the extension and the diversity are astonishingly big. It's a very diverse country in terms of its terroirs. Altitude gives it a very distinctive character. We'll be going through that a little bit later. It's an extremely dry climate. Its average rainfall is between 150 and 250 millimeters a year, which is like an average weekend where I live. Very low fertility in the soils. The water, of course, comes from the Andes. When the Spanish arrived, they found an incredibly complex system of irrigation that had been put in by the Inca. And obviously, there's a very strong commitment from a lot of wine producers. It's 895 wine producers, along with many other smaller projects. So next, please. Okay, so it's the 8th largest country in the world, as I said. The extension from north to south along the Andes Mountains, which kind of binds everything together, is 3,800 kilometers. From north to south, it goes from 23 to 45 degrees south and just 20 degrees longitude from east to west. Next, please. Okay, so altitude. Let's just deal with this. When I started putting these menus together for Gaucho back in the late 90s and the early 2000s, one of the things that I really had to consider was how we were going to make this easy for consumers in a restaurant to understand the terroirs, the individual terroirs of the country. So I did this by using a combination of altitude and latitude, something that we sort of call three-dimensional winemaking. You're going from north to south, east to west, high to low. So the temperature regulator for the grapes is altitude. So for every 150 meters you move up into the mountains, you lose 1 degree Celsius in average temperature. The other thing that altitude does is it concentrates UVB light. So for every 1,000 meters you're going up in altitude, you're gaining about 12.5% UVB. And of course, as you're going higher, the air becomes less dense, so that this UVB does really have a very profound effect on the grapes, particularly the red grapes. Okay, so next, please. Okay, so it's dry. It's very dry, continental, as I said. Just in the north of Argentina, in Patagonia, we have an average about 150 millimeters of rainfall a year, which is very low. And then in Mendoza, it can vary from between 200 to 300, normally at about, on an average, about 250 millimeters of rain a year. And that rain falls generally in February, March, during the autumn. Of course, we're in the southern hemisphere, so the seasons are opposite to what we have here. So if you look at this figure here, you see that Chile and Argentina, very often Chile and Argentina are mentioned in the same breath when it comes to wine, but when it comes to climate, they are completely different. Of course, Chile relies on the Pacific Ocean, the cool winds from the Pacific Ocean and the rains from the Pacific Ocean, where they can dry farm. Not always, but they can, for its cooling influence. Whereas if you go over the mountains from Santiago, for example, which is, of course, the capital of winemaking in Chile, and directly it's a 45-minute flight over to Mendoza, you are going over the tallest mountain range in the southern hemisphere and the west. So the Andes mountains here are at their highest. Next, please. Soils. Soils, I think, is something that winemakers have in the last 15 to 20 years really put a lot of their effort into researching. And before, it was never really considered to be a particularly important part of the terroir. But the knowledge of soils now is such that it has quite a profound effect on the way in which water is used. This water, of course, in a desert, and we are in a desert here, is a very scarce resource. And so making better use of the water is something that is foremost in people's minds, particularly as we have global warming beginning to affect some vineyard areas. But also it means that they can put in a much more exact water regimen because everything is irrigated in Argentina. So next, please. So there are two main ways in which water is distributed into the vineyards. When I ran a finca, the small 7.5 hectare vineyard in a place called Lulunta in Luján de Cuyo, which is the main kind of old area of wine production in Mendoza. The vines were planted in 1929, so it was an old vineyard. And we used flood irrigation, and the irrigation departments along the spine of the Andes in Argentina are incredibly efficient. They have to be, because they knock on the door every week and they tell you when you're going to get your water. You then phone up your Tomero. These are the irrigation engineers that come into vineyards that are flooded, and they will. The water will flow through your property for maybe a given 2 or 3 hour period every week, and that Tomero will then open up the furrows and distribute the water to any part of the vineyard that needs it. So it's not just a case of flooding the whole vineyard. You can actually direct the water to particular parcels in the vineyard where the water is needed. And generally, if you're using flood irrigation, you're going to do that not necessarily weekly. Sometimes you're going to do that monthly, depending on the soil types that you have. If you've got deep soils, sandy, with some ley and some loam and clay, then the water, of course, is then it filters through the soils much more slowly, and so that can be retained within the soils more easily. When you're going higher up into the Andes, into the more recent areas of viticulture, then drip irrigation is what is used. Drip is normally daily. You might take your water from a well, or you might be taking your water from a river. There is something called rights to water in Argentina. Your water is, if you have your proximity to a river, which of course the rivers are very important, then you have the right to some of that water, and you can take that water for yourself. There's no cost other than the cost of bringing the water to your property. And if your vineyard doesn't have rights to water, then your land is worth nothing because you can't produce anything on it. So really the growth in vineyard areas has been restricted to those areas that have rights to water. And some of those rights are very old and some of them are more recent. But water distribution is very carefully planned in a desert, as you can imagine. Next, please, Peter. So today, Argentina is the 5th largest wine producer in the world in terms of volume. It's the 7th largest in terms of cultivated surface. It's the 10th largest wine exporter. Argentina only really started exporting its wines in the mid-90s, and during the early to late part of the 1980s was really when a huge amount of investment came into Argentina, not just from Argentina, but from outside. And it has been ever since. And yes, its main markets are the United States, followed by the UK, followed by Brazil, Netherlands, and Canada, and then it goes down to Germany. And you guys have been growing quite well in the last few years, so thanks very much for that. So next, please, Peter. So just a little bit of a timeline in terms of history. I mean, we talk about the New World, but it's a country that's made wine since 1551. It's an old part of the culture in Argentina. It was due to when the Viceroy of Peru, which was Lima, the capital, when Jesuits started coming into the country, they went up and down the Andes and east as well, starting their missions, and they introduced Vitis vinifera to Argentina. And these grapes mostly came from the Canary Islands. So for 300 years, really, the only grapes that were grown there were, first of all, Listan Prieto, and then followed a little while afterwards from Spain, Moscatel de Alejandría, and then they crossed, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But really, the industry didn't really start getting any kind of scale until around 1850, when the British came and built the railways, and they had one of the largest railway systems in the world at that time. And there was a direct link between the wine capitals down in Patagonia in the north, San Juan and Mendoza, direct to Buenos Aires, where negotiants could then buy the wine and bottle the wine for the market, because it was a huge market. But it was mostly consumed within its own country. Things changed again in 1853 with the arrival of Michel-Émile Pouget, who brought with him 100 grape varieties from France. He first went to Chile and started the Quinto Normal, the School of Agriculture, a little before, and then was persuaded to come over to Argentina to do the same. And then he ended up staying in Argentina for a considerable length of time. And this, of course, started with, before then, really, we only had the Spanish varietals and a couple of the Italians. And then the Italians arrived in the 1870s. And between 1870 and 1930, the majority of the immigration into Argentina was from Italy, and largely as a result of phylloxera killing off the vineyards in Europe. So there was a lot of expertise brought to the country to make wine, and many of them, or most of them, ended up in Mendoza. This also came in with the French, who came with the banks, so there was money available to buy land and start your own viticulture projects, and that's really when it started booming. Then comes the 1970s, when Argentina was quite isolationist at that time, had a military junta, and so the model was really to produce a huge volume for their own domestic market, and that collapsed in the late 70s and early 80s. During that time, there was a pretty brutal vine pull scheme, where people were encouraged to pull up vines and start growing tomatoes and onions and other produce. And Argentina lost, at that time, around 50,000 hectares of Malbec, which is kind of, if you consider that hadn't been done, how much Malbec they would have, and of old vine Malbec would still be left. But there's still quite a lot of it left. And then, of course, in the 1990s, all the markets started opening up, and we had a huge amount of investment coming into the country, and that's when they started to export. I think the first wines from Argentina arrived in the UK in about 94, 95, and not even some of the big names were there then. It was just a few small, and then in the late 90s we started getting some of the bigger wineries coming into the market, and then going to the rest of Europe. Next, please. Legislation. 1999, there's a framework for wine origins, what we call the GIs, and they are becoming more and more important. Most of the GIs, geographical indications, there are no laws with regard to the making of the wine in respect to the GIs like there is in Europe, but the laws do apply to designation of origin for the grapes and for the wines that you're making. So what you're going to be seeing over the next few years is this being predominant on the labels. So whereas the old world is going towards great varieties, the new world, in the case of Argentina, is kind of going much more towards the geographical indications. And this, I think, is essential for the future of Argentina in terms of its diversity. In 1989, there were also some DOCs started. There were two, one in Luján de Cuyo, which is the sort of Hollywood of Malbec, if you like, and San Rafael to the south. But these are rarely used for wines now. There are some wineries that still use DOCs, and they have a range of wines in which they use the DOC. And we're actually going to taste one of those today. But only Luján de Cuyo now is used with a handful of wineries. And these GIs are being submitted and approved by an organization called the INV, the National Institute of Viticulture in Argentina, who look after all of the legal aspects of wine. If you're going to export your wine to any country, you have to submit samples of that wine to them to give you an export certificate. So this is where all the policing of the winemaking is done. They also are responsible for a lot of the research and development that they do, and they have a technical institute called INTA, which also looks at some of the ampelography side of and using water and the sort of technical side of wine. So next, please. So you'll see here, I mean, it's unless you've got a very big screen, you won't be able to see all the names on there, but the vast majority of these names have now got geographical indications attached to them. They're mostly political. There's one or two that is not in terms of its designation. It's a political district, it's a village or a town. And there's some of them that are recently have not, but we're going to go through that a little bit later. Next, please. So if we were to talk about Argentina generally, and I did this a lot when I was putting these wine lists together, I always went from north to south and then from east to west. And really what you're doing there is you're going from, if you're going from the north, you're going from the world's highest vineyards down to the south along the Andes. You're then ending up in Chubut, which is where we have the world's most southern vineyard. So Argentina really is a land of extremes in that sense. So I'm just going to go through each of these four categories. There are 23 provinces in Argentina, of which 12 make wine. So when you see the names on the labels, very often you'll just see the name wine of Argentina. Sometimes you'll have the name of the province. So it might be Salta wine of Argentina. But now we're going much more in depth into these GIs. So it might say Cavallati, Salta, wine of Argentina or product of Argentina. So next, please. So if we look at the north of Argentina, this only accounts for 3% of the output of wine, but it is significant because this is where we have the highest vineyards in the world. So if we start right in the north, we're going to a province called Jujuy, where we have a handful of wineries and a small number of vineyards, but it is growing. And this is where we have the highest vineyard in the world, which is currently at 3,329 meters above sea level. It barely registers really, but I've been here and it really is dizzyingly high. But if we're going in the north, we have to go high. We have to go very high because we're in the Tropic of Capricorn here. So we're getting more towards the tropical climate, and although it's very dry, we have to be. The further north you go, the higher you have to go in order to escape the heat. So we have the four provinces: Jujuy, Salta, which is the main wine region in the north of Argentina; Tucumán, which just has a handful of vineyards and a couple of wineries; and down to Catamarca, which is also a significant area of wine production. You don't see so much wine from Catamarca in European markets, but it is a significant market. It's just only slightly less than Salta in terms of how much is made. But it's very significant because the wines from here are like nowhere else on earth. They are from an extremely dry climate, an extreme climate, very high in altitude, from 1,800 meters really up to 3,000 meters. We are on the edge of what is possible in terms of altitude in making wine. So next, please, Peter. Then we come to Cujo. It's not used so much as a identifying on a wine label, but this really is where 95% of the wine is made in Argentina. It includes the provinces of La Rioja. That is the third largest area of wine production in Argentina. And then down to San Juan, which is the second largest. And then, of course, the biggest, which is Mendoza, which is responsible for 75% of all of the wine production in Argentina. San Juan accounts for about 17% and La Rioja about 6%. So it's huge, and 188,000 hectares of vineyards cultivated here. We go from altitudes of 430 meters in the east of Mendoza up to 2,000 meters above sea level in the north of Mendoza on the border of San Juan, where there are some projects. Extremely cool climate there. Okay, next please. Well, Patagonia, the Atlantic. Again, this is a small a part of the industry. It's fairly insignificant in terms of volume, but again, it's very significant in terms of its extremes. It's very far to the south. It's incredibly cool climate. We have oceans of water available to us here, so this is where a lot of people are going to start new projects because the availability of water is a given here. We have close proximity to some of the big rivers in South America. We have the provinces of La Pampa, just a handful of vineyards there, and then Neuquén, which was recently planted from 2000. It's a very new area. It's one of the newest areas of winemaking in the world. And then the Rio Negro, which is right next door, which is very old. It's actually, there used to be around 60 wineries here, but the rise of Mendoza meant that some of the wineries down in Patagonia they started producing apples and pears and cherries, an area for which it became very famous, and moved away from wine. But there are still a handful of wineries down here that still operate, and there are a lot of old abandoned vineyards that people are now buying up and bringing back to life. And then we go down to Chubut, which is very new. This is as far south as it's possible to go in winemaking. It's very cool. It's risky. Here we have frost and hail, one of the things that make it very risky. But as you imagine, these regions, they are very good for the cool climate varieties: Riesling, Gewürztraminer, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc. These are the great varieties that are mostly played down here. There's some Malbec and some Cabernet Sauvignon. There's even a bit of Tanat down here. And then if we go to the east, we go to Buenos Aires, which is again very new as an area of wine production. The only area of wine production in Argentina that relies on coastal influence for its cooling. Okay, next please. So we just go on to grape varieties. 58% of the varietals are red. It's a country that has always drunk red wine, and its culture of wine drinking is predominantly red. 18% of the varietals are white. The biggest advances, I think, in winemaking in Argentina have come from the production of white wine. Argentina is producing really good white wine these days. It's not something for which Argentina has been known, but I think a lot of lessons that have been learned in the way in which we make the red wines has actually transferred to how white wines are made. I'll go on into that a little bit more. And then there's pink varietals, which make up 24%. What are these pink varietals? Well, I will talk about that in a moment. Next, please. So the red varietals, as you would expect, Malbec is the grape variety, which is mostly grown. Interestingly, after the vine pool scheme of the 1970s, in the 80s, Argentina was left with just 10,000 hectares of Malbec. And for a while, there was a thought that perhaps that they should go with Cabernet Sauvignon as a grape variety to make it their calling card. And then a number of individuals came, like, for example, Dr. Nicholas Catena, and realized that you could make world-class wine with Malbec. And so the whole revolution came. But if you look at plantings in 1960, 60,000 hectares of Malbec were in Argentina in 1960. It was the dominant grape variety. So 50,000 hectares were lost in that short period of time. Then we have Bornada, which is not the same Bornada that it is found in Italy. It's actually Corbeau from the Savoie. And for a long time, they thought it was the Italian varietal. We now realize that it's French. But the Argentines, being Argentines, have refused to rename it. They pretty much own this grape variety in the world now. They grow more than anyone else. And it's a very popular and very widely drunk grape variety in Argentina. And there are some exports of it too. And most of that Bornada is grown in the east of Mendoza, which is kind of like the industrial powerhouse of the industry. And then we have Cabernet Sauvignon, Syrah, Tempranillo. Argentina produces a lot of Tempranillo. Of course, that came with the Spanish later than the other varietals, but it came with the Spanish. Merlot, Pinot Noir, Cabernet Franc, Tannat, Petit Verdot, which were bought by Aimé Puget in 1853, along with Malbec and all the other grape varieties that he bought from France. Next, please. So white varietals, Torrontés Riojano is the most widely planted white grape. This is a grape variety that belongs to a family of grapes called the Criollos, and I'll talk about that in a second. Then we have Chardonnay at number 2, for which Argentina is gaining a very good reputation particularly for some of the top Chardonnays that are getting out of this world scores from some of the critics at the moment. Sauvignon Blanc is fairly recent. It only came really in the 1990s to Argentina, following the popularity of Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand. But we have some old varietals that came with Aimé Puget again. Chenin Blanc, Viognier came a little bit later with Roberto de la Motta in the 1980s, and Semillon. And Chenin and Semillon are interesting because most of the vines that are these two grape varieties are really old. So Argentina is home to some very old Chenin Blanc and very old Semillon. And then we have two other clones of Torrontés called San Juanino and Mendocino, which are not nearly as revered as the Torrontés Riojano, which is where most of the quality Torrontés is made from, and Riesling, and then a few other grape varieties. So next, please, Peter.
Yeah, just to remind you, it's time for the first wine to be poured, right? Because we start in 3. It's a slide number 19.
Yes, indeed.
Yes. So you can pour the first wine already. Yeah, and yes, to all the attendees, do not forget to use the spittoons as always. And now I'm coming. Yeah.
Okay, but then we have a group of grape varieties called Criollos. These were born in Argentina. Muscat of Alejandría and Listan Prieto came before, but Muscat of Alejandría came about 50 years later from Spain, and they're planted in the vineyards, and they crossed. And they produced a number of offspring, including Cereza, of which this is a pink varietal, of which there are 27,000 hectares in Argentina. So it's a very commonly grown grape. It's mostly used for local wines, jug wines, as they call them. Criolla Blanca, Criolla Grande, which is also 17,000 hectares. So these are used for Tetra Pak and the cheaper bottles for everyday drinking, and delicious that they are. Moscatel, various forms of Moscatel, Moscatel Blanco being pretty widely planted. We have about 2,500 hectares. And Pedro Jimenez, or Jimenez, no relation to Pedro Jimenez. This is another one that was born of the crossing of Listan Prieto and Muscat Alejandro, and it's white. And this is used a lot for base wines for sparkling. Sparkling wine industry is very big in Argentina. And then we have Toronto's Riojano, which is one of the Criollas. San Juanino, Mendocino, they're sort of slightly less good quality. And they're so called because Riojano was in La Rioja, San Juanino from San Juan, and Mendocino from Mendoza. But they do taste very different, even though they do have a sort of grapey Moscatel character. And then we have some slightly strange ones like Criolla number 1, which is a cross between Criolla Grand and Malbec. I've yet to taste one of those, but I've been told it's very good as a varietal. And this is where a lot of work is being done by Inter and the INV, because we're beginning to see these being exported, particularly there by young winemakers who want to really keep these old vineyards and these old varietals alive, because they have such a story. And it's interesting that these grape varieties have adapted to, because they were born in, adapted to the climate and global warming better than any other. So it makes sense that we keep these varietals, not just for posterity, but since they're so ideally suited to areas like the east of Mendoza, which is getting warmer and warmer, and they maintain their acidity, and they're pretty resistant to these hotter temperatures that are being felt in the east of Mendoza. So this is really where they belong. There's a few in the north as well, and down in Patagonia, but most of them are found in the east of Mendoza, which is where, if you go to Mendoza, you buy your local wines. They normally come in a Tetra Pak, or and they're consumed locally by local people, and it's a lot of it produced. So next, please. Okay, so if we look at the last 20 years of grape varieties that have been planted and grape varieties that have been lost, it's interesting that these old varietals, these Criolla varietals, are being scrubbed up. They're being pulled up at quite an alarming rate, and that's because much of east of Mendoza is it's no longer financially viable to produce wine there on the kind of scale, and also because the Argentine market itself is becoming much more sophisticated as a wine market, and it's quite a demanding market for quality. So these sort of everyday wines are now becoming a little bit old-fashioned, and a lot of people are now, they can't make it work financially to grow these grape varieties, even though they're extremely productive. You can get really good high yields from them. It just, for them, many of them, it just doesn't make any sense. So we've been losing, Criolla Grand is the biggest one that we've lost, even though we still have 17,000 hectares left. Moscatel Rosado, there was a time during the 1970s when they were producing lots of cheap wine for domestic, when people were drinking mostly rosé wines made with this grape variety. There are still some people making it, but again, it's for the local market. Pedro Jimenez, Cereza, Moscatel de Alejandria, it's a shame because this is an old varietal in Argentina. Chenin Blanc, Toronto, San Juanino. There are a couple of grapes there that are used for table grapes, like Superior Seedless and Sultana, but which is another side to the industry. But we've lost also some Italian, like the Sangiovese, and some Barbera as well we've lost. And what we've gained, of course, is Malbec. This is where, in the last 20 years, we have, nearly 27,000 hectares have been planted just in the last, since 2000. So this is obviously where people are seeing the value for exports. We also have Syrah, Bornada, Cabernet Sauvignon. Ancellotto is very interesting. An old Italian grape is being kind of resurrected in Argentina. And unsurprisingly, Chardonnay, Tempranillo, Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir, and then a couple of grapes that are used for the table. Next, please. Okay, so let's go to our first wine. So Chardonnay. This is from a Chardonnay from an area of the Uco Valley to the south of Mendoza. It's a cool climate valley. There are a lot of people that think that the Uco Valley is new. It's not. It's an old area of wine production. Wine has been made here since the 17th century. Much of the vineyard area was lost during the vine pool scheme, but there's most of the investment in Argentina, particularly in Mendoza, has been put into this area. And this is where we find the best Chardonnay in Argentina. I can say that very confidently in the much higher climes because, of course, it's a cool climate varietal. It loves a cool climate. And this is also where we have areas that are abundant with chalk. And some of the higher areas go into category, well, Winkler category 1 and 2. So, you know, we have some, apart from the lack of rainfall and the intensity of the sun, we do have some kind of similar characteristics to Burgundy. So we can grow some pretty good Chardonnay up here. So you'll note also here with the alcohol, 13%. You know, there was a time when I first started buying back in the 90s and early 2000s, when we were having Chardonnays at 14.5, maybe even 15%. Because the concentration from the grapes and the late picking of the grapes meant they were big and fat, more of a kind of Californian style. But now in the last few years, they've gone much more towards a Burgundian style and an elegant style of Chardonnay. And that's shown in the levels of alcohol that you're seeing. We're picking much earlier. I'd say on average that in Mendoza, depending on the year, of course, but they're picking perhaps a month earlier than they were 10 years ago. And this has been quite a revolution in the way they're making their wines. And I think that's largely because many of the winemakers are traveling to Europe and doing harvests in Europe. And they want to find more finesse in the wines. So, yeah, so this is it's not an expensive Chardonnay. You know, it's a mid-price Chardonnay. What do you think? Very deft with the oak. Only 5% of it was oak aged, and the rest is in stainless steel. So it's a very clean, fresh, pure Chardonnay. I can only speak for the UK and some other parts of Europe, but in terms of white grape varieties, apart from Torrontés, in the supermarkets and the big stores, we're seeing quite a lot more Chardonnay from Argentina coming onto the shelves because they represent such good value for money. Next, please. Just while you're tasting that, some stats about Chardonnay in Argentina. We've got nearly 6,000 hectares of Chardonnay in Argentina. Some of the Chardonnay is actually on its own roots, but most of it is Pierre Franco. It's grafted, and this is really the only grape variety that we've needed to graft in Argentina. Most of the other vines in Argentina are ungrafted, and this is because we don't really have problems with phylloxera in the same way that many other areas are. Of course, Chile has no phylloxera at all, but we have pockets of it, but it's very easy to manage with the irrigation systems and the sand as well in some of the areas. Phylloxera does not like sand. So most of the vines are on their own roots.
A question on the chat. Yeah, it's the oak or non-oaked style of Chardonnay more popular in Argentina.
I'd say it's a kind of cross between the two. I think there was a time when everybody wanted their Chardonnay oaked because they wanted these sort of Californian styles. And now over the course of the last 20 years, they've been dialing back on the oak. And you have to remember, of course, when you've got pesos and you're buying oak from France, from the famous Tonnelleries in France, it becomes extremely expensive for them. And so it's not just a question of style, it's also a question of cost. And there has been, because that you get such beautiful purity of fruit and acidity and the minerals that you get from the Uco Valley, I think there's much less use of oaks. But I think most of the Chardonnays that you're finding in Argentina have just a very small influence of oak. And then, of course, there are the very top ones like the Catena Whitestones and White Bones and Otronia down in Patagonia. They use oak, but again, it's very judicious. It's really dialing back. It's used oak, maybe not all of it. It's 100% oak. It's very much in the back. So I think Argentines like their Chardonnay to be lean, very clean, a little mean, and dialing back on that oak influence. Just having it as a support rather than being dominated, because the fruit's so pure here. It's so beautiful. So I'd say there is a lot of unoaked Chardonnay made as well, at a sort of more basic level, but there isn't really any top Chablis style Chardonnay that is made without oak there. Maybe that's something in the future, I don't know.
And what about the oak chips?
No, not unless it's really cheap. And it's not worth making cheap Chardonnay in Argentina. You may as well do it with Pedro Jimenez, with other grape varieties. Most of the Chardonnay is in the Uco Valley, the high levels of the Uco Valley, and it's an expensive place. So it wouldn't make economic sense to produce Chardonnay just to put oak chips in it. And I think that's something they learned from Australia. No, they do not use oak chips in unless it's very cheap. No, they'll use either oak barrels, used or new, or foudres, which are used more and more these days, the big 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 litre barrels that they're bringing in, just so that it has less impact. This is one of the biggest changes in winemaking in Argentina in the last few years, is this dialing back on the oak. They have much more confidence in the fruit now. Next, please. Just to show you where you are. Now, you're going to see this map a few times over the course of the wines that you're tasting. And I'm just going to show you here. If you look at this line here, this is a road called the Route 40 that goes all the way from North Argentina to the south. It's one of the world's longest roads. And it runs parallel to the Pan American Highway in Chile. And this road goes all the way from Mendoza City down to the south. And either side of the road, we have three main regions in Mendoza. This one here, the Uco Valley, which is where we're tasting from, is divided into three. In the north, we have the area of Tupungato. In the middle, we have the area of Tunuyán. And to the south, we have an area called San Carlos. And we have sub-regions within there. So, for example, with this one from Vista Flores here, which is at around 1,000 to 1,150 meters above sea level, it's a pretty big area of wine production. It's one of the older areas of wine production in the Uco Valley. And it's very much dominated by French wineries moving here during the 1980s and early 90s. People like Michel Rolland came here. You have, this is split by two rivers. This one here is the Rio Tunuyán, which separates San Carlos from Tunuyán, and then Tunuyán from Tupungato is separated from a river called Rio Las Tunas that you see here. And these rivers are big, they're very dominant. Of course, you need those rivers because they're supplying the water and the water rights to these areas. So the Uco Valley, in terms of altitude, goes from around 1,000 meters up to the very top end of Huerta Jari here and new areas up to 1,900, 2,000 meters above sea level. And this differs from what's called the Primera Zona. And there's actually a drive between here and the Uco Valley, which takes about an hour and a half. So this is, it's big. Mendoza is actually bigger than England as a province. It's a big province, and you have these two rivers that supply. You have another one here as well, but they all actually start in the same place here, and you have you don't really have any protection from any mountain ranges here. If you look at the mountains, you see these three colors here. Here you have what's called the pre-Cordillera. And then here we have what's called the Cordillera Frontal. And then here, with the very high mountains here at the top, we have the main Cordillera, which is where we have the high mountains like Aconcagua, Mount Tupungato, and the Rio de Plata. So you have these three, but you don't really get any kind of protection from your elements here. So it's one of the reasons also why it's much cooler here. In the Primera zone, the premier zone, otherwise known as Luján de Cuyo and Maipú, here we have a little mountain range that's in the way of the main mountains. So you get some protection here. So it's also quite a lot warmer here. And this is really where Malbec was first planted. This is the old area of wine production in Argentina, in Mendoza. Luján de Cuyo, you're going to see that a lot on labels, and Maipú. And very often they're associated with kind of the first wines that came to Europe and the United States in the 1990s. Mostly came from here because the Uco Valley hadn't really taken off in terms of planting it to such an extent as it has today. So just in a short few years, really, it's become a major area of wine production. But this is where most of the wines came from. So there were these big, ripe, rich wines that people fell in love with when they first started drinking Argentina. And then we have the east. And where it says East Mendoza, that says 6,300 hectares. I'm sorry, there's a zero missing off there. There's 63,000 hectares. It's almost the size of Rioja in terms of how much wine is there made there. And it's mostly the Criollo varietals that I was talking about earlier, but we have some Bonarda, Malbec, Tempranillo, Cabernet Sauvignon, etc. here. And this is really where most of the wine for its local consumption is made. It's not that the Argentines only drink their wines from there, but this is really the sort of lower end of the market. This is the Tetrabricks. This is the everyday stuff. So that's where we're in Vista Flores here, which is very rocky. We have some sand and loam here. And, you know, it's pretty good for Chardonnay. There's been Chardonnay there, grown there for quite a long time. One of the first areas to be planted with Chardonnay in the Uco Valley. Next, please. And just to give you an overall idea of the Uco Valley, we're going to be tasting a few wines from here as well. So you're going to see this map a few times. If you look at it from an aerial photograph, where we have the north here, which is Tupungato, and that's split into a number of different sub-regions, most of which have now IG status. Some of them are still awaiting IG status, Indicación Geográfica, or GI. I'll call it GI just to make things easier. You have, for example, Hualtajari here, which is yet to get status because someone owns the name. So these things kind of get in the way of progress sometimes, but I think it's such a big area that it'll end up being split into different areas anyway. And then we have here the Rio Las Tunas that I was talking about earlier, and then here we have the Tunajan River that then flows out to the east. And so we have Vista Flores here, a new area called Los Chicayos, which is becoming very trendy. And then to the south, we have San Carlos. So Tupungato, Tunajan, San Carlos, with then sub-regions coming in. Okay, next, please. Okay, next. Anyone have any comments about that Chardonnay? They like it? Would they buy it?
Yeah. There's an information is lightly oaked on the label, but
Yeah,
it's
just 5%. Just 5% of the wine was oaked. The rest was in stainless steel, so it was blended.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so Argentines, I would say, are a very resourceful people. If you look at the economics of the country, it's been lurching from disaster to disaster over the last few years, certainly since I've been going there, for the last 20 odd years, maybe even longer than that. And so they tend to make the best of what they have. And someone came up with the idea of planting Pinot Noir in Cavajati in Salta in the north of Argentina. And you can imagine that's probably not an ideal place to plant, but it was something that they tried anyway. They realized after a while that Pinot Noir was not going to be famous from this place. So what do? They make a white wine from it. And it's quite common to do that. Also, it's quite common to do that in years where they have a lot of rain, and they necessarily got to get the quality from the red grapes, so they'll make a white wine from it. This is something that they want to do to make the best of what they have. 1998, for example, was a disaster for Argentina. They had a very wet year. They had 1,000 millimeters of rain in 1 month, and so they suffered from rot and mildew, which is something they don't really have to contend with because they have such a dry climate. So they made a lot of sparkling wine and white wines from red grapes. This is something that has been a little bit more considered. It's a Blanc de Noir made with Pinot Noir, 100% Pinot Noir from Cavajati in the north of Argentina, in the Calchaquí Valley. And I think it's quite an interesting wine. I think it's, again, it's a case of making the best of what you have. El Esteco is an old winery. It used to be called Michel Torino, started in the late 1800s. And if you've ever been here, it's a very remote part of the world. It's it's in the middle of a very high plateau in the Andes Mountains. It really does beg the question as to whatever possessed anybody to start making wine here. It's such a inhospitable place to make wine, and yet you could make fantastic wine here, and obviously they saw that potential then, but these were one of the first wineries. And these days it's owned by the Peñaflor Group, who also own Trapiche and a number of other wineries that perhaps you might see on the supermarket shelves in Poland. And they're one of the biggest exporters and one of the biggest wineries in Argentina. Nonetheless, they encourage a lot of innovation in what they do. They're not afraid to try new things. So this is it's not been oaked. It's got a slightly pink color to it since it's had some skin contact during pressing, something you can't really get away from, particularly here up in the north where we have such intensity of sunlight. And we're at about 1,800 meters above sea level here. If you ever get the chance to go to Argentina, this is one of the places that you must go to. It's like nowhere else on earth in terms of just the beauty of the place, but also how difficult it is to make wine up here. And well, the soils tend to be very sandy. We have some rivers here. We're in a valley called the Calchaquí Valley. Next, please. Just to give you a little bit of an overview of Pinot Noir in Argentina, we've got just over 2,000 hectares planted, mostly famous in the south, Patagonia, in the provinces of Neuquén and the Rio Negro, where we have some very old vines of Pinot Noir from the 1930s. That are producing some quite interesting wines from people like Bodega Chacra, Neuquén, which is much newer, and then Mendoza, which is being increasingly planted very high up into Mendoza, where we have chalky soils. We have, as I said, a much more Burgundian style climate. So this one, of course, is from the north, so there's not very much Pinot Noir in the north in Salta, 19 hectares. So someone obviously came up with the idea and thought, oh, should we try Pinot Noir? And then thought, no, let's not try Pinot Noir, and made a white wine from it. So again, it's making the best of what you have. Next, please. And if just to give you a little map of, this is the Calchaquí Valley. Peter, can people see my arrow here when I'm pointing to here? Can they see the arrow?
Unfortunately not.
Here? Okay, I'll just take it as maybe a no. But the Calchaquí Valley starts just in the north of Catamarca and goes up and winds its way through the province of Salta and Tucumán. And interestingly, if you look at the eastern side of the valley, it's more green. This side of the valley is rainforest, and the Calchaquí mountain peaks here that you see are almost permanently covered in cloud. I know this because I traveled over in a small aeroplane, a terrifying journey in a small aeroplane a few years ago, which I will never forget. And if you go across the valley, you then have the Quilmes range, which is, again, is very dry. So we get 150 millimeters of rain here. But what makes the production of wine here possible is actually this rainforest area and the cloud cover, because during the course of the day, as the sun is rising, of course, from the east and setting against the backdrop of the Andes Mountains in the west, we get some shadow from the cloud cover of these mountains from around 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, which gives it helps to moderate the temperatures of the vineyards, and also it helps to shield some of the some vines from the intensity of the sunlight. So it's only because of this that we're able to make wine here. It's something you don't really appreciate until you go there and you see that this cloud cover comes over the vines in Cavajati, which is a little town where most of the wine is made. And it's quite interesting, but without that, we wouldn't have, it would just be too hot, too dry to make the wines here. Anyone have any thoughts on that? I think it's quite a clever wine, this. The winemaker is Alejandro Pepa. He's been there for years. He really is Mr. Salta. He knows more about this area than anyone. So if you do go up there, make sure you speak to him. And like many of the wines that you're tasting today, they're using native yeasts. They're not using cultured yeast or industrial yeast to make the wine. It's very much more of a trend these days to use the native yeast, to trust them more, to make sure that you get a full fermentation. Okay, next, please. Okay, unusual grape varieties. Well, Argentina has over 150 grape varieties planted. It actually has more diversity in grape varieties than any other New World country. Some of it is used for table grapes and raisins and to produce must, but it's a small proportion. It's about 25,000 hectares. The rest of it is used to make wine. And this is a Pequeñol. Pequeñol is sometimes known as red Chenin for some reason. But there is quite a lot of this grape variety in Argentina. There's 512 hectares left of Pequeñol. It came from southwest France. And there's only 1 hectare left in France of this grape variety. So it's interesting that Argentina is really very much responsible for making sure that this grape variety doesn't die out. It was used to add color to wine. It's a wine that does produce quite a lot of color. Sometimes it's confused with Cabernet Franc and Fur, Prune Lard, and Durif, but it's actually its own grape variety. It was discovered in 1999 when ampelographical studies were made, and there is some argument that it is actually related to Savagnin from Jura. Yeah, and these vines are old. They're about 100 years old. This is from a place called El Zampal, and this is an area that really got forgotten when all these new plantings were coming into the Uco Valley. But it is an area that a lot of young winemakers are buying their fruit from, because we have lots of old vine Chenin, Criolla Chica here, or the original Listan Prieto. There's quite a lot still left here, and Semillon. And for a while, these growers, they had no one to sell the fruit to because there was no demand for it. And I think this new generation of winemakers, like Herman Macera, who is the winemaker, are very keen, to make sure these people stay in business and that they can still grow these grapes, and also to make sure these old vineyards don't disappear. And this is very much something that Argentina is very keen to do now, just to hold on to these old vineyards. that are here. So some of the very top end wines from the young winemakers that you find in the Uco Valley in Mendoza, people like Herman and the Michelinis, they're buying their fruit from here. We have to remember the vast majority of the grapes that are grown in Argentina are not grown by wineries. They're grown by families. There are hundreds and hundreds of families in these winemaking regions that have been growing vines for generations. And they sell their fruit, of course, to the wineries. And so the wineries work with them, of course, to be able to produce the best fruit possible. But without these families, you would be nothing. And it's a very old tradition in Argentina that you have these shake of a hand, I'm going to buy your fruit for the next 10 years. And that's how business is done. And of course, these guys were getting very, very low prices for their grapes until these young guys came along and said, listen, we'll give you a good price, a fair price for the grapes, and at the same time resurrect some of these grape varieties that were beginning to die out. Anyone have any thoughts on that? Next, please. So just to show you where we are, before we were in Vista Flores here, now we are in El Zampal, which doesn't have an IG. It hasn't been designated an IG yet. I think it will, but it's quite a significant area, particularly for young winemakers, as I said, that are coming here and buying from these old vines that still exist in the Uco Valley, that are becoming more and more treasured as time goes. There was a time when all these old vines were very much taken for granted by growers and winemakers, but now, of course, as they're disappearing, there's a real desire by winemakers to make sure that they are kept for the patrimony of Argentina. Next, please. Just to show you where we are. Yes, so we in the very fashionable northern part of the Uco Valley. It's not even mentioned here, but it's just south of. It's on the other side of the road. There's a road that comes along at the bottom of Hualtajari and travels through the Uco Valley called the Route 89. And it's on the other side of the road to the Route 89. Terribly unfashionable area for your grapes, but for wines like this, it's perfect. El Zampal. It's a relatively small area, but again, it's dominated by old vines. Anyone have any comments on that wine? Very unusual, very juicy, I think. I like. It's not every day that you're going to taste this grape variety.
It's too early, perhaps. Yeah, there is something.
Yeah, it's quite spicy. Yeah, I agree. It's quite a spicy varietal. It's quite lean as well. It's not a fat wine. It's quite easy drinking, I think. Yeah, and it's good that we have winemakers that are making wines like this, and it's these winemakers are kind of becoming quite fashionable in the way they do things. So next, please. Zuccardi. Familiar Zuccardi. I don't know. Someone actually. I asked someone to make this look nice, and they put El Zuccardi Q. It's not El Zuccardi. It's Familiar Zuccardi. I apologise. This Q range of wines was actually developed for Tesco's back in the 1990s, and Tesco stopped buying them, so they've kept this Q range, which is kind of like a very accessible premium range of wines that Zuccardi make. In the last few years, they've moved from their original home in Maipú in the east of Mendoza, much warmer area, up to the Uco Valley with huge investments, particularly in a place called Paraque Altamira, where they've just built a fancy new winery and restaurants, and there are not so many wineries in the Uco Valley. One thing about the Uco Valley and the rest of Mendoza, the Uco Valley is designated as a pristine zone. So you cannot take any fruit or any vegetables or any kind of matter between the Uco Valley and the rest of the area, because it's so they have checks when you're going in and out of the valley of everybody. You try and bring a banana or an apple in there, they'll fine you because they don't have any kind of diseases. There's no Pierce's disease. There's nothing. It's just a completely clean valley. But anyway, this is from the east of Mendoza, very unfashionable area where they have quite a few vineyards. This is where they first started. Jose Sucardi's father came in 1963 with a new irrigation system, and he built these vineyards. He started these vineyards just to actually show people what the irrigation system, how it worked, and then from there built a family business that went into the wine business. Tempranillo, Argentina has the highest number of hectares of Tempranillo outside Spain of anywhere in the world. Unsurprising given the history of Argentina. But there's 5,500 hectares still left. It's widely drunk in Argentina. We don't see so much of it coming from Argentina, but I think this is perhaps the best example. And I used to sell this grape variety. I used wine by the glass in Gaucho. It was wildly successful. I sold a lot of it. Having said that, I haven't tasted this 2014 vintage since, I don't know, for a few years, because I was selling it relatively young then. So I really would, I'd like to appreciate what you have to say about how this wine is aged over time. It's been in a combination of French and New Oak for 12 months, so it's a fairly standard style of making wine in Argentina. And it's a pretty warm place, as you imagine, being in the east of Mendoza. We're in a place called Santa Rosa, which is, just 680 meters above sea level, is pretty warm. Next, please, Peter. So just to show you where we are, we're going to the east now, so we're moving away from the mountains towards the east. It's a very green, lush area of wine production. Of course, we have much deeper soils here because we're lower down the valley. We're close to the Tunajan River that starts in the Uco Valley and flows north. Again, it is the powerhouse of the industry. It's where most of the table wines and quite a lot of other wines are made. And it's home to 63,000 hectares, almost as big as Rioja as an area of wine production. So, anyone have any comments about that? I think, getting a wine that is 7 years old now, Tempranillo, don't know what it costs, but it'd be quite interesting to see what the evolution is on that wine.
Let me make a comment, because this wine is, Tucardi is very well known on the market, and it became a benchmark for Argentinian wines. And frankly, I don't like this style.
You don't?
No, I don't.
Okay. What is it you don't like about it, Peter?
Well, this is something too traditional to me. It keeps the image of the wines from the I don't know, 90s, 2000.
Yeah, a bit old fashioned. Okay.
And you? What about you? You like it?
I haven't tasted one that's that old, to be honest. I've normally tasted it. I've normally sold it when it's, they normally release it after a couple of years, a year in barrel, a year in bottle, and then they release it. And so it's much younger. And I like that style. It's a more modern style. But I honestly, I don't know. I have no real frame of reference as to how this wine will age. Of course, we're all going to be comparing that to a Rioja, aren't we, in how it ages. But I don't think it's made to be aged either. So it'd be quite interesting to see. I'm sure there are going to be some people that are going to list that just from the point of view of having a Tempranillo from Argentina. But there is a lot of it there, and it's good. Good Tempranillo, but again, it's a question of style, whether you like it or not.
All right, so here's to you, folks. Phil likes it. I don't, and you? Please write something on the chat, or perhaps you want to speak. No comments. We do not pass on.
Okay. 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 Just if you next slide, please.
Okay.
Just to show you a map of Eastern Mendoza. It doesn't look very big, but it is actually very big.
So
That
very greenish taste. Yeah,
green,
yeah, green.
I very
I
greenish.
like it, but some steak will. Yeah. So they were shy. They were shy.
Okay, very greenish taste. I liked it, but need some steak with this one. I'm sorry, there's not much I can do about that right now. If I could then land a steak on your plate, I could. But clearly, some of these wines are, of course, meant to be with food. But yeah, I find that Tempranillo from Argentina differs from Spain insofar perhaps it's a little more extraction. It's a bit more robust. Um, yeah, I get the sort of greenish. Maybe that's just the evolution of the wine. There's some maybe some oak tannins in there. I don't know, but yeah, I like the mouthfeel of it though. It's quite rich and round and soft. Okay, so that's Eastern Mendoza. There are 9,000 hectares of vineyards in Santa Rosa and 63,000 hectares of vineyards in that area that looks so small, but it's massive. But would sell easily. Well, okay, yes, I could say we sold a lot. People really liked it. It was different from a Rioja. It's perhaps wasn't as Maderized as some of the Riojas. The Grand Reservas and the Reservas and stuff. But yeah, interesting. They sell a lot of this wine, so I don't think they're going to be too scared about what you say about it. So next, please. Now for something completely different. Zaha. This is a small project which was founded by Jeff Malzbach and Alejandro Sejanovic. Alejandro Sejanovic is perhaps the most decorated winemaker in all of Argentina. He was responsible for planting many of the vineyards that Catena Zapata planted at different altitudes. And he was actually he was more a viticulturist than a winemaker. He was more a vineyard manager as well. So he managed the planting of all these vineyards in the 1990s when Nicholas Catena started planting on all these different areas of Mendoza and Argentina. And this is a small 7-hectare vineyard in Paraque Altamira, the south of the Uca Valley. And this is one of the areas which is the only area actually that has been given an IG based on its soil profile. There are lots and lots. It's a very stony soil. It's alluvial, and those stones are literally painted in calcium carbonate. So this is something quite unique as a region. It loves limestone, as they said, soils, and so it's this is one of the areas, as well as Hualtajarí to the north in the Uca Valley, where Cabernet Franc has been planted in the last few years. And I think that this grape variety has an amazing future in Argentina. I remember, I think it must have been about 10 years ago now, that I did a blind tasting for decanter of 47 Cabernet Francs from Argentina. And I think from that 47, there were 9 that scored over 95 points. So we kind of discovered something. I think Argentina had kind of discovered something that they perhaps didn't realize that they had, and that was particularly in the Uca Valley, this perfect place for Cabernet Franc. Cabernet Franc came with Amy Puget in 1853. There is actually there's a couple of vineyards in Luján de Cuyo where there are over 120 years old Cabernet Franc, so they must have some of the oldest Cabernet Franc in the world here. And so it's a really good Cabernet Franc from there. But in the last 20 years, well, 2002, we had 200 hectares of Cabernet Franc in Argentina. And we now have 1,450. So it's a small percentage of the number of grapes that are grown in Argentina, but it's becoming more and more significant. Partly because growers can get double the price than Malbec. So there's a financial incentive for people to grow Cabernet Franc in Argentina, because all the wineries are pushing ahead, not only blending Cabernet Franc with Malbec and other grape varieties, but making single varietal Cabernet Francs. The question is, of course, Is the market ready for Cabernet Franc? I don't know, because, you know, people love Malbec. Malbec, we're going to be talking about it a little bit later. But I think that one of the big supermarkets in the UK, Tesco, have just in the last year actually put a Cabernet Franc from Argentina on the shelf for £12, and it's selling amazingly well. You know, it's one of the only Cabernet Francs you see on a supermarket shelf in the UK. So I think there's a strong demand for Cabernet Franc, particularly from Argentina. Jancis Robinson recently said that Argentina is probably making the world's best Cabernet Franc at the moment. Who am I to disagree with Jancis Robinson? But it is something that they've kind of woken up to discover, that they have the great place to make Cabernet Franc. Next, please, Peter. So distribution. Well, 50% of the Cabernet Franc that has been planted in the last 20 years has been planted in the Uco Valley, the cool regions. So that's where it's going to be, and this is where most of the planting is happening. But there's also some in Luján de Cuyo as well, a little bit in San Juan and some in Salto. It's very good from Salto too, but it's not significant in the general scheme of things. Most of it is in Mendoza, and you'll see here this was actually done about a year and a half ago. See here it says 1,258 hectares. We're now got 1,450, so we've planted 200 hectares since this was done, just in the last year and a half. So this is how fast people are planting Cabernet Franc. They're really putting their bets on this is going to be the next thing from Argentina, as well as Malbec, of course. Any comments on this wine? Next, please, Peter. Just to show you where we are, again, Paraque Altamira in the south, stony soils, lots of calcium carbonates, Winkler 2 to 3, depending on the year. So it's still a pretty cool climate, but it's not as cool as some other areas in the Uco Valley. And again, it's the only IG that has been formed because of this chalk that we find in the soils.
Yeah, so sorry, this is 2017, not 2018. So yeah, that's there was a mistake. But yeah, so this one, if I may say, I like it. I like the structure. I like the nose. So now it's to you, Phil, to say you don't like it, and then we share the opinions with the others.
Yeah, well, I love it. I love it. I mean, you know, it's in the hands of, for me, one of the best winemakers in Argentina. Of course, they haven't been working with this grape variety very long, but actually, Alejandro Sahanovic planted a vineyard of Cabernet Franc for Nicolas Catena in a place called El Cepillo, a very cool part of the Uco Valley, even further south than in San Carlos, sort of, you know, about 50 kilometers south of Altamira, which is very cold area with lots of chalk. And so he knows, you know, he was one of the first pioneers of planting all the new Cabernet Franc there. I love the purity and the cleanliness of this wine. I think it's this lovely pink peppercorn, and there's a little bit of core of sort of diesel oil that runs underneath it. I just love that sort of juxtaposition between the ripeness and this zinging freshness that you get on the nose.
Right, so here's to you. What about you? Do you like it? You don't like it? You, the unseen.
Yeah, sorry about that vintage thing. I was assured that it was 18 from the producer, but then, you know, this happens all the time for me when I'm working in different countries. Okay. When you get the 18, I'll tell you that's really good as well. 17 was actually a little more problematic as a vintage than 2018. Okay, next.
So 17 is better. Sorry.
Yeah? I'd say actually when you get the 18, it's better than the 17. I mean, the 17 is really good, but the 18, yeah, best wine so far. Okay, great. Someone likes it. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Magic. Yeah. Okay. Next, please, Peter. Just to show you where we are, we're in the very far south. Peter, can I just ask you? I'm moving my cursor here. Can you see that or not? No. Okay,
No, no.
that's a shame. We're in the very far south of the Uca Valley, as I said, in Palaki Altamira, and very chalky, right up against the mountains as well. So we haven't got much protection with a little mountain range in the way. We get everything. So that's one of the reasons why it's also very cool here. Next, please, Peter. Okay, so we go from sort of very modern, new winemaking to something a little bit more traditional. Bodega Bianchi was actually one of the first wineries to export from Argentina, and I remember buying their wines with my first menu that I did in 1999. So they're very traditional old winery based in a place called San Rafael, which is quite separate to the Uca Valley and Luján de Cuyo and the main part of Mendoza. It's actually much further south, about 200 kilometers further south. And it's kind of on its own. This is an area that is not so high in altitude, so we're going from about 700 to 900 meters above sea level, but it's an area where you have plenty of water. And this was first populated by French winemakers that came over. So there's a very French feel about the place, which is why they grow a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon here. It's the dominant grape varietal, and also they have Malbec, of course. This is a more high-end wine from the traditional winery. Here, if you see the alcohol in this is almost 15%, but I think it hides the alcohol particularly well. It is more reminiscent of the wines that used to be made in Argentina 10, 15 years ago, but I think that there is still a really good market for these styles of Malbec, rich, really big, quite meaty, intense. We get very low yields here, so we get, enough grapes to make wine from 2 plants, 1 bottle. So it's naturally a very low yielding area. And it's just a place that's dominated by a few quite big wineries and quite famous household names. Bianchi is a household name in Argentina. 2018, fantastic vintage almost everywhere in Argentina, but particularly in Mendoza. Everything came together. For me, one of the best vintages I've ever tasted. Other vintages, 13, for example, was a great vintage as well. There is vintage variation, but not in the same way as you would get in Europe. So, next, please, Peter. To give you an idea of where the Malbec is in Argentina, we have 44,000 hectares, most of which, of course, is in Mendoza, but we also have some in San Juan, 2,700. San Juan is a much hotter climate than Mendoza as we're going further north. We also have a wind here called the Zonda wind, which raises the temperature as well, a famous Zonda wind that comes down the mountains and keeps everything really nice and clean. And then in Salto, we have quite a lot of Malbec. It's pretty famous, for these big, rich, meaty wines that you come from here. Then La Rioja Mountain. But what the interesting thing about Malbec, and this is one thing that I think is going to assure Argentina's future, is you can taste Malbec from every single province that makes wine in Argentina. So you can taste it from north to south, east to west. And the variation in the terroirs means that I think it's not just going to be a question of Malbec in the future, it'll be where your Malbec is from. Don't know whether you agreed with me, but I think we will get to that point because, in the UK, it's wildly popular. It's the second most grown red grape variety now. So people love it. But I think, those people are now new to Malbec when they start, maybe get a bit older and start getting a little bit more knowledgeable about wine. They'll start thinking about where these Malbecs are coming from. Next, please, Peter. So San Rafael, you can see it's separate from anywhere. It's not a huge area, but it produces quite a lot, and it's one of those areas that gets a bit forgotten because it's not trendy like the Uca Valley or Luján de Cuyo in Mendoza. But there's some pretty big names here. There's been a lot of investment in the last few years in trying to improve all the quality of the wines from here. They do have problems with hail here. This is one of the areas where we have the most hail. Hail is something that we get a lot in the Andes Mountains because of the altitude and also climate change. And so hail nets are very common, particularly here, which also reduces a little bit the sunlight intensity too. So you've got some other famous names like Suter, Alfredo Rocca, Jean Riviere, Argenceres. Some of these names you may or may not know, but they all come from down here. Recently, Bianchi have just invested in the Uco Valley. They've gone up to a place called Los Chacajes. They bought a winery there and they bought vineyards. So they're like many wineries in Argentina. They are investing in these new areas in order to combat climate change and also to premiumize their offerings. Anyone have any comments about that? Anyone like it, not like it? Do you like the style? Do you don't like the style? Restaurant wine, and again, I think it demands a steak, this wine. What do you think, Peter?
I think, after this, the Cabernet Franc was something dominating, yeah. And we have first comments. Very nice wine. Yeah.
Okay.
But Zaha was to me something much more impressive. Some other comments coming.
Can we go to the next slide, please, Peter?
Sure.
Okay. Okay, so this next one is from an old winery in Luján de Cuyo in Mendoza, the only area in the Americas that still has a DOC. It was the first DOC that was formed in the Americas. This is from a vineyard that was planted in 1898. So many of the vines are 120 years old. You know, we have, interestingly, if I give you just a little bit of a rundown of the age of vines in Argentina, we have 49%, nearly 50% of the vines are less than 20 years old. But from 21 to 40 years old, we have 22%, 47,000 hectares. 41 to 60 years old, we have 42,000 hectares. 61 to 80 years old vines, we have 14, nearly 15,000 hectares. And 80 years plus, we have 3,786 hectares, 1.8% of the surface planted. So yeah, and it is just a very good point, actually. It's good to go back to these wines and see how they evolve in the glass, because some of them might need a little bit of time in the glass or decanting. Anyway, this one is a DOC. So there are a few wineries like Norton, Luigi Bosca, and these guys, Bodega Lagarde, that still make these range of wines that they call DOC. And the DOC wines in Luján de Cuyo, the vines have to be more than 50 years old. The aging has to be in oak for at least 12 months, and the yields can't be any more than 5,000 tons per hectare, 5 tons per hectare. So they have pretty strict rules in order to put the DOC on there. But again, there's not many wineries that are using this system, and it only forms a part of their portfolio, really. The winemaker's a guy called Juan Roby. This winery is run by a pair of sisters, that look after this. I love these wines. I love the kind of elegance of them. I think they're quite French in style. It's these wines are getting better and better, I think, from this winery. It's from a Grelo in Luján de Cuyo, which is the largest sub-region of Luján de Cuyo. It has its own IG. It's quite a cool region because it's in a bowl. Next slide, please. It's kind of in a bowl, so that when the morning sun comes up, it takes a while for this cool air from the night to clear away. We have a big difference between day and night temperatures here because we're in a desert, and also because we're at altitude, so therefore the air is less dense. So generally, we have thermal amplitude range of between 15 and 20 degrees. We have that is very beneficial for the grapes, of course, because it maintains acidity and it means a slower ripening of the grapes. So as soon as the vine, of course, goes below 15 degrees, it shuts off and there's no more breathing and no more maturation. So it's a very stop-start process to the maturation. It's a slow maturation of the grapes. Okay, anyone have any comments about that? I mean, that's 120-year-old vines we're tasting this wine from. Next, please, Peter. Just to show you where we are in Agrelo, we're in Luján de Cuyo, and where you see it going sort of south there, that's going towards the Uga Valley, and then we have an hour's drive over the mountains to go to the Uga Valley. So it's in the south of Luján. This is sometimes known as the Primera Zona, and you have two areas, Luján de Cuyo and Maipú to the east. These are the old traditional areas in Mendoza where Malbec was first planted way back in the 1850s. So this is really the home of Argentine Malbec. And I must make a comment, actually. Peter brought this up earlier about the Malbec that came to Argentina. The Malbec that came to Argentina did not come from Cahors. It came from Bordeaux. The Malbec in Bordeaux, of course, came from Cahors, but it would have changed. And when it came in 1853, it came pre-phylloxera with Michel Puget. And so the clones, all the clones that came with him at first came from Bordeaux. And at that time, 60% of the vineyard area of Bordeaux was planted with Malbec. So people often will make a comparison between Malbec Cot in Cahors with Malbec in Argentina. They're pretty different. I mean, they're the same grape variety, but of course they're very different. Malbec is changed in Argentina. It's adapted. It's slightly changed. It's adapted to the climate, and the climate's very different. So, there are some that would say, Malbec, the home of Malbec is Cahors. Of course it is, but it's travelled to Argentina, and Argentina has made it very much their own. So, yeah, it's interesting. It's just where it came from. The name Malbec, by the way, it derives from in the late 18th century when the Gironde was being planted with grape varieties, and they were draining the land away from the Gironde. And there was a gentleman called Sir Henry Malbec, who supplied much of the genetic material for the planting of the grapes, and thereafter the name Malbec stuck as a grape variety because he supplied all of that grape variety to there. So that's how it came about. So they say. How true that is, I don't know, but it seems like the most plausible reason why it became known as Malbec. Okay, next please. So we're now going to go to a fairly modern style, fairly modern Malbec, Punto Final. This is made by Bodega Renacer. It's very common in Argentina to take your grapes from different areas and blend, and this is exactly what they've done here. So they've taken cool climate Paraque Altamira, Malbec fruit, and warmer climate Perdriel in Luján de Cuyo, and they've blended the wines together. The vines are all over 50 years old. As everything is pretty much done by hand in Argentina, the grapes are always harvested by hand. That's the normal thing. That's the way it's been always been. Some mechanization is beginning to creep into some areas, but it's still predominantly everything is hand picked. It's no oak. So this is I think Malbec actually is really interesting because I think Argentina is one of the countries that actually leads the world in making unoaked wine, simply because most of the wine is drunk fairly young, but also we could be making them at a premium level too. It is because we have such beautiful polymerization of the tannins and the anthocyanins and the grapes, and they're soft. So we don't need to worry about aging to bring a softness to the wine. They're already soft. We can have that immediate vibrancy of fruit. Maybe one of the reasons why it's become such a popular wine, such a popular grape variety, is just this immediacy, the vibrancy that you get from the fruit. So yeah, this is a small winery. It's not a big winery, but they're pretty well known, and they're very successful with their exports. Native yeasts as well, as with most of these wines. I think 10, 15 years ago, they were using cultured or industrial yeast to make the wine. Now they're very much believe in working with the native yeasts to ensure a full fermentation. Maybe that comes with confidence. I think it's a great value wine as well. So we've got a cool climate and warmer climate here, so it makes sense. You can bring the acidity up, you can get that more vibrant fruit that you would get from the cooler climate, and this lovely weight and softness that you get from Luján de Cuyo. Anyone have any comments about that? Next, please, Peter. So just to show you, we've got these two areas. We've got Paraque Altamira, and we also have Pedriel, which means stones. It's a very stony soil in Luján de Cuyo. So we have perhaps 5-6 degrees difference between these two areas on average, which is enough to ensure that we have quite a difference in the acidity and the softness of the tannins from the warmer area, and the immediacy of the bright vibrancy of the fruit from the cooler area. Next, please. And just putting you a little map. So we've got about 150, 160 kilometers between the two, north-south, and about 5 degrees difference. Next, please. Okay, so we're just staying on this whole theme of unoaked Malbec. It doesn't have to be a cheap wine to be unoaked. We can have some premium unoaked wines. This is made by Mauricio Lorca, a good friend of mine. I met him through this wine, actually. He was showing it at the London Wine Fair a few years ago, and I loved the idea of this sort of premium Malbec made without oak and this beautiful purity of fruit. This is from Vista Flores, the same place as the Chardonnay that we first started here. This is a place that I think gives you a very unique floral, spicy, black pepper character to the wines. I've always loved this range. He makes a Sauvignon Blanc, he makes a Chardonnay, he makes a Malbec, a Syrah, and a Cabernet Sauvignon in this range called Opalo. And this is very much his calling card. I love what he does so much that I actually asked him to make the wines from the vineyard that I managed for those 10 years. But we had these vineyards in Lulunta, in Mendoza. So yeah, I just love the purity that you get from here. And this is Malbec at it has a wild character as well. I think there's a slightly kind of Garrigue wildness about this wine. But anyway, I'd love to know what you think, because I do love these unoaked wines at this kind of price level. I think they offer such a this is very terroir. It's there's nothing that gets in the way of this wine. Anyway, I'd love to know what you think. Next, please. Just Vista Flores again. Like we did with the first wine, where we are in Tunajan. Next, please. And this is where we are at Tunajan, which is the middle part of the Uco Valley in Vista Flores. And yeah, it was one of the first areas to be cultivated, and one of the first areas to get this new investment that came into the Uco Valley in Mendoza. Does anyone have any comments about that? You like it, Peter?
Yes, yes, I did. Yes. But come on, guys. This gentleman, yesterday they lost the gold medal against the Italians, and now he is here. He's speaking to us. And what about you? You didn't lose anything yesterday.
Yeah. I wasn't allowed to drown my sorrows because I knew I had to do this today as well. So I made sacrifices for this.
Yes, he did, actually. And now there's no comments. Yeah, I like the style. I'm still under this Cabernet Franc. I like it very much, and but yeah, that's like the fruitiness. I like the structure.
I love the aromatics on this violets and lavender that you get on the top. I think that's one of the things I love about Malbec. This very flower, these dried flowers, these roses, like violets, lavender that you get on the nose. I love it. It's very vibrant, and the color is beautiful. It's a beautiful color. Malbec for me is the most amazing red color wine. It's this beautiful red color, this vibrant purpley red that you get.
Okay. Now they are ashamed. Yes, they don't want to make any comments.
Okay. Next, please.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're back to the Uco Valley to the south. I'm back with Alejandro Sahanovic. This is a brand that he has called Manos Negras, Black Hands. This was his first, after he left Catena Zapata, with Jeff Mausbach, that he started this project. And he's pretty much everything he's done is based in Paraque Altamira. He's kind of Mr. Paraque Altamira, if you like. So this is this has French oak. 20% of it is new, malolactic fermentation in oak. It's kind of pretty cool climate, and he's taken this from a specific soil part of the vineyard. They're very stony soils, so to show the sort of vibrancy that you get from here. So this is very much the trend at the moment, this microvinification of this kind of precise viticulture that they're doing, and that comes from knowing the soils a lot more. They do these everyone now is doing maps of their soils profiles based on water conductivity, to see what they have down in their soils in terms of chalk, clay, sand, and they'll take specific parts of the vineyard, they'll harvest at different times, they'll make microvinifications and blend, which is now being very much the norm for these kind of wines in the last few years. And now they're beginning to sell the wines based on this kind of soil profile, which I think is very interesting. So we've not just got single vineyard, but we've got single soil wines within that vineyard. And they actually make these guys make a number of wines from this vineyard that concentrate on soils that are dominant in silt, gravel, chalk, and these limestone, these caliche, they call it, these kind of limestone blocks that they find in the vineyards. It's very interesting. Again, lots of pink pepper, vibrant, more red fruit that you get from here, I think, than black fruit, and have this little bit of spice that goes over the top. What do you think? It's a very modern wine. This is the new school of Malbec that is coming from Argentina, and it's telling you a story of a very specific place. Next, please. Again, Altamira in the south, so we're very cool here, 1,150 meters above sea level, right next to the mountains, Winkler 2 and Winkler 3. Yeah, and very, very site specific. Next, please. And just so this is, again, just to repeat, this is the only area that has been given an IG based on its soil profile, these stones that are covered in these calcium carbonates. Anyone have any comments about that? You like this, Peter?
So this is the same, yeah. This is the same as Zaha, yes.
Yeah, it's actually from the same vineyard. It's from the same
right.
vineyard. So, I mean, see if you can see a kind of a terroir characteristic, a stamp that is on this wine. I certainly think you get this really a lot of freshness from here, but you get this kind of there is a little bit of green in it as well. You know, like you did with the Cabernet Franc, which naturally has a green core through it, but there's a little bit of a green core through this wine as well, giving it some energy and vibrancy and a bit of tension. And attention is what they're looking for now in these parts of Mendoza. They like these. They're not these big ripe wines. There's a lot of vibrancy, tension, energy in the wines that they have. I don't know if you got that from this wine, but I certainly do get it.
No, it's what is strange to me. It's they do not look like the same winemaker. You know, it's to me they are. It's not only the question of different variety, but it's like.
Well, it's very specific, this wine. It's not just about the grape variety. It's about a particular place. So it's from these soils, which are very stony. So they've just taken it from these individual vines from this part of the vineyard. So, you know, it's pretty precise in terms of what they've done.
And you, what do you think, ladies and gentlemen? Poland. I don't know. Perhaps it's too hot here. You know, we have 32 degrees.
Oh, really? God, I'm so jealous.
Yeah.
It's raining here. Has been for the last 2 days.
Happy you. Right.
Okay, next, please. Okay, we're now going to organic. Domaine Busquets is the largest organic producer in Argentina. This is called Amari. It's a red blend of Malbec, Cabernet Sauvignon, Syrah, Merlot. The traditional blend, when I first started buying from Argentina, was always Malbec, Cabernet Sauvignon, and Merlot. This one has a little Syrah in it. It's not uncommon to do that. And all these vineyards are certified. It's quite an interesting story. This guy, Busquets, they basically uplifted their whole family operation in Carcassonne in France, winemaking family, and came to Val d'Ajary. When they saw it, and they were on holiday in Mendoza, when they saw it, they couldn't believe what the potential that there was in this place. And they bought a huge area of land. They built the winery, and they sold off a portion of the land to new people that were coming into the Uca Valley to start their own projects, people like Sofenia, Rutini, and obviously when he sold that off, that helped to finance the whole thing. But the whole family just uprooted because they just saw what an amazing potential. And Val d'Ajary really is the kind of cru, one of the Grand Cru areas of Argentina. It doesn't have an IG. It doesn't have any geographical indication at the moment because someone owns the name. It's a very big area. We're going from 1,100 meters to 1,900 meters above sea level. So we have lots of different terroirs in this area. And I think in future, we'll see that it's going to be split into different areas with their own names, like Monastero, for example. There's an area called Monastero there, which some really top-end wines are coming from. Here we also have calcium carbonates, but they're more integrated into the soils than they are in Paraque Altamira. They started as organic. They certified organic for many years, and they're doing particularly well because of that. It was a very good decision for them. Lots of wineries are now beginning to go organic in Argentina. It's not. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's a lot easier to go organic in Argentina than it is in perhaps other areas of the world because it's so dry. Many farmers farm organically anyway. It's just the way they do things, and they always have done things. We don't really have problems with pests. We don't have any pests to speak of. We don't have any real problems with the traditional diseases that you will find in Europe, like rot and mildew and molds and this kind of thing. It's too dry for that, so it's pretty easy to farm organically. To get it certified is a bit more expensive, so that's why a lot of people don't bother to get certified, but I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the future. And well, it's a big wine. Yes, it's a pretty big wine. It's quite intense, in your face. It does demand a slab of meat. And yeah, what do you think? I'd love to hear your comments on this. It's a very typical blend that you would find, and this is one of their top end. And this is actually their top end wine. Malbec blends, interesting. I think that it's always quite difficult to get people to drink blends from Argentina, but when you start mentioning that it's a Malbec blend, perhaps that's another way in which you can get people to. But the tradition in Argentina is always to blend. Next, please. Thank you. So, well, Tashadi, where are we? We're here. We're in Tupungato, in the north part of the Uco Valley. This is where Catena have their famous vineyards, the Adriana vineyards, for example, where all these top-end wines are coming from. El Enemigo as well, made by Alejandro Fijil. So really, they put these on the map. It's a very new region of wine, of viticulture. It's only really been planted in the last 20 years when Dr. Nicholas Catena was the first to really plant in this region. It's very high, as I said. We have chalk in the soils. It's been identified as being one of the great areas for future in Argentina. And yeah, I don't know what that means. Sorry, in Polish is also good. Yeah, thanks, Peter. Okay, great. It's a big wine. It's a big blend. It's a very intense blend, and again, it demands food. But and traditionally, Malbec has always been blended with Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, less so than Cabernet Sauvignon, Petit Verdot, and Merlot. Interestingly, we're losing Merlot vineyards in Argentina, but we're gaining some Petit Verdot. There used to be a lot of Petit Verdot in Argentina. In the 1930s, it was one of the dominant grape varieties. Again, bought by Amy Puget to Argentina. I think it blends really well with Malbec, particularly. So does Cabernet Franc. And we're seeing more blends actually with Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon these days with Malbec. I think it goes very well. But again, traditionally, it's always been Malbec, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, 1, 2, 3. Next, please. Just to show you, Vuelta Shari, this is like, this is being heralded as the new cool school. It's where all the cool kids are. This is an area that is it's seeing huge amounts of investment, and it's high altitude. Just to the north of that, you'll see a place called La Carrera, which is where people are planting now. That's even colder. We go from Winkler 3 to Winkler 1 in Vuelta Shari. The top end of Vuelta Shari, we have very, very cold temperatures. And in La Carrera, it's all Winkler 1. So again, it's the high altitude area of the Uco Valley. Okay, next please. So we come to the last wine. and I was told that I've got to be very strict with the timing here. So I've left a really iconic wine till last, and I think this kind of tells you about a little bit about the history of the last 25 years of Argentina. This is made up of this wine is always made up from these 5 vineyard areas that Catena have planted, the oldest of which is in Lunlunta, which is where all the genetic material that they gathered during the late 80s, early 90s. The Catena family undertook research to find the best clones of Malbec to plant, and there were literally hundreds of clones. They narrowed it down to 15, and then they planted these 15 clones in this old vineyard in Lunlunta, and then took that genetic material to plant in other areas of Mendoza at different altitudes and different latitudes. So this Lunlunta, this vineyard in Lunlunta, is perhaps historically the most important vineyard in Argentina. And it's just round the corner from the vineyard that I used to run. And this is where really the whole revolution in Malbec in the last 25 years and giving some identity, some regional identity to this, it really started here with Nicholas Catena. And so we always have some fruit from here. It tends to be very lush, deep, dark, black fruits from here. I love this region. For me, it's one of my favorite regions in Argentina for Malbec. I'm always emotionally very connected to the place because I used to live there for periods of time during the year when I was doing all my work for Gaucho. And then we go to Agrelo, which is where they have the famous Pyramid winery. Agrelo, again, has an IG like Lunlunta. We've already had a wine from there, a Malbec from there, which was the Guarda. This is the largest sub-region of Luján de Cuyo. Sort of more red fruits, quite spicy, that you get from here. And then Paracre Altamira, which we've covered already with a couple of wines to the south of the Uca Valley, where we have all that chalk and those round stones that are covered in chalk. And Huerta Jari, which is where they have the Adriana vineyard, where all of these Grand Crus that are getting 100 points are coming from. This is their famous vineyard, lots of different soil profiles going within the same vineyard. And then Pampa El Sipilo, which is where they planted their first Cabernet Franc back in the day, to the south of Paracre Altamira. This is the coldest part of Mendoza. It's a risky place to grow vines because we have frost here. It's pretty common to get frost and hail, but again, very cool climate. And every year they make this blend from the wines that they make from here. And of course, the blend every year changes. But I remember when this wine came out, and it was really a revolution for Argentina. This was really the first premium, super premium wine to come out of Argentina, and it was already showing you the work that they'd been doing for the last 20 years by blending them all together. And though in those days when this came out, the idea of single vineyard wines was pretty new to Argentina. And of course, now they have a lot of these, like most of the wines we've tried today, they're all single vineyard or single region wines. But this one brings the whole thing together. So it brings old vines from Lunlunta with not so old vines from Agrelo, newer vines that they planted in Paracre Altamira, Huerta Jari, which are less than 20 years old, which are already garnering reviews from all over, and Pampa El Sipilo, which is really cold. So we got warm to cool to cold in terms of areas. Lots of different soils. Lunlunta and Agrelo, much deeper soils, more sand, a little bit of loam and clay. Paracre Altamira with all that chalk and sand and a little bit of clay. Huerta Jari, the same, but in a different makeup. And Pampa El Sipilo, which is again, lots of chalk. So we have this kind of, amalgam of everything. And it's a classic. It's become a classic. It's still, I think, it was one of the first kind of high quality Malbecs that came onto the market. I remember this came onto the market in the UK. I bought the first vintage of this, which was, I think, 1994, 95, when they bought this wine out. There was a big hoo-ha when they bought it out. And they kind of this is one of the wines that set Malbec onto its path of popularity, I guess. But also, it showed what you could be done at this quality level. I've actually been very lucky to be present when they decided the blends on this. I've played around with blending the different components. I actually used to sell all the different components separately, and people can blend them in the restaurants. So people had a lot of fun with that. But yeah, it was a revolutionary wine, and it still maintains its place as one of the top premium wines from Argentina. Anyone have any comments about it? And it's really changed as well. The first vintages of this were very different to what they are now. I think these are more svelte and elegant in the style. Just like, these guys, most of these high-end wineries have now gone much more towards elegance in the wines than power that used to be the kind of calling card for Argentina. What do you think, Peter? I don't think it's possible to not be impressed by these wines. I think they're absolutely fantastic.
Yes, you're right. You're right. But yeah, we have some comments. The coming back to Amery. Coming back to Amery, this is 15 degrees of alcohol, 15%. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you were saying with the whites, you were saying that no more high alcohol level in the whites. Yeah, but the reds they still.
Yeah. The reason why we have a higher alcohol in the Amaury is because they had some rain, so they had to delay. They had to delay the picking of the fruit. So by the time they got to pick the fruit, once you get rain, you can't harvest when it rains. It's impossible in Argentina.
Sure.
So they have to leave. They have to give time for the grapes to because they swell. It's like being a desert and not having any water, and suddenly you find a pub that's selling Carlsberg beer. They're going to drink as much as they can, and so they had to leave them. And by that time, the grapes were quite ripe, and then of course you're going to get a bit more alcohol. But generally, they're picking much earlier. But again, it's not always possible to do that. We have these sub-regions all have their own micro terroirs. They're very different. So, sometimes Paraque Altamira might not have a rainfall for a few weeks, and then in Walter Jali, it's been raining for 3 or 4 days solid. So, because we've got vast differences between these sub-regions. So interesting comment here. The minerality in the Manos Negros is amazing. Great balance and freshness. My buen vino, exactly. Yeah, it's that chalkiness that you get, and from the stones, the stoniness as well. Yeah, there is an energy to these wines from here, I think.
Mm-hmm. But do the other vintages of Amery have lower alcohol level?
Yeah, okay. They do. They're generally 14.5. I mean, look,
right.
There's a big thing about alcohol. I mean, let's not forget, we're in the southern hemisphere. We get 300 to 320 days of sun a year. We have sunlight, which is, maybe 15 to 20% more intense UVB than anywhere else. So you're going to have more sugar. And if you're going to have more sugar, you're going to have more alcohol. This is something that time and time again, I've been, when I was judging at Decanter, you'd have someone who just judged Burgundy the day before come to the table and start judging Malbecs from Luján de Cuyo between 14 and 14.5%, saying, oh, these wines are too hot. Well, yeah, you have to kind of just say, okay, we are in a different place. We are in a much warmer place. We have more sugar accumulation during the grapes. They're picked at phenolic ripeness, which is guaranteed there. Of course, you're going to have more alcohol. But we generally get less alcohol in the wines than we did 10 years ago, between 1 and 1.5% less. And there's much more of a kind of a general wish to make wines that are more drinkable, that you can drink a couple of bottles over the course of a nice lunch with your friends. a much more a much less alcohol. And yeah, okay, occasionally you're going to come across a wine like that, especially with a top end blend that is going to have a bit more concentration to it and a bit more alcohol. But it's all about the balance of the alcohol. Yeah, another thing, I would really recommend that when you drink these wines for pleasure rather than tasting them, you put them in the fridge for an hour before you drink them. They need to be drunk at between 14 and 18 degrees. No, certainly no more than 18 degrees, because then you're going to get this massive smack of alcohol. So also Olivera make a great impression. I've never tried Beccagnole before, but love it already. Great. Well, the only place where you can get it from is Argentina, so go ahead and buy some.
Also, there's also one comment in Polish regarding the Amery. The finish is drying up due to the alcohol level, I presume. Yeah.
Or just maybe needs a bit more time in the bottle. I don't know. The interesting thing is most of these wines, when they get bought or served in a restaurant, they're young. They're drunk young. I like Malbec when it's young. I love its vibrancy and its purity and its vivacity and its energy. We've not really been aging these wines. I have tasted some old wines from Argentina from the 1940s, 50s and 60s. And some of them aged really well. And generally, actually, they had lower alcohol levels in those days than they do now. And that maybe that's a consequence of global warming. I don't know. But I've started to age some of these wines now. I'm putting them in. I've bought a house last year. I've actually got a cellar in the house, so I can start putting these wines away. And I think it's very interesting to see how these wines will evolve. Will they evolve well? Are they suitable for aging? I would argue that many of them are. The question is which ones. But when they come from chalk, I can tell you this now: if they're coming from Paraque Altamira or Huerta Jari or Los Chatajes, this high part of the Uca Valley, or from Patagonia, these cooler climates, they definitely age well. They really do. I don't know why, but they do. And people used to say Malbec can't age. Well, I don't agree. I think it depends it's where it's from, which is why regionality is so important, I think. So, maybe buy a couple of bottles, forget about it for 10 years, come back to it, and you're going to be very surprised at how well these wines evolve. The Cabernet Francs also really evolve well. That Zaha, I think if you tuck that away, that you've got at least 10 years in that, and it will be fantastic. Maybe if we can do this in 10 years' time with the same wines, I don't know.
The question is if we will be fantastic in 10 years from now.
Well, the thing is, the wines are getting better and better as well, which means, we've got more acidity, we've got less extraction, we have less use of oak, we have more tension in the wines. And, this is something that comes from cooler places. And this is something that they're seeking out. And this is something that actually it's been quite a challenge for me because, I now have to convince all those people that fell in love with Malbec from Luján de Cuyo 20 years ago, the big ripe oaky wines, that this is the new way. And not everybody is particularly enamored with that. But the young winemakers of today are definitely moving towards this much more austere, energetic, tense style of red wine, particularly from these cooler areas and from some of the other more traditional areas too. Winemaking has changed beyond recognition in the last 20 years. It really is amazing how it's changed. Anyway, that's me. That's done. I think we've tasted all the wines now. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you had this is obviously a look at what is already in the market. Peter's going to send you the recording of this along with the pricing of the wines and who the importers are, just so that you can see. Well, if you have any questions or you want to ask anything from me, Peter will give you my email address. I'm very happy to answer any questions that you send to me that may be a bit shy of asking during or any comments I hope you enjoyed the tasting. I hope you enjoyed the wines. Thank you, Peter, for your help. I've really enjoyed doing this today. I purposely didn't get a hangover so I could do this today, despite the disaster that was last night. But anyway, I've really enjoyed presenting this to you.
It was not fair, Phil. It was not fair
Oh,
from
well,
the
life's
Italian.
not fair.
Yes.
Life's not fair. I think we still made a good account of ourselves despite losing. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Phil. It was really, you were one of the best speakers we ever had, and for sure you were the best English-speaking person we ever had. Yes,
oh, great.
Yes, but
well, let's do another one. Let's do another one with some more funky wines next time. Wines that are not in the market, the new cool school.
Oh.
That's what we're going to call it.
I'd love it. Yes, let's do it. Let's do it. Thank you very much. Thank you, folks.
Thank you all for coming and taking part. Really appreciate it. I really appreciate your time. I know all of our time is very precious at the moment, so I really appreciate you coming and listening to and tasting the wine. So I hope you really enjoyed it. And thank you, Peter, for everything.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.